Hello, my name is Brandon Rupp. I'm going to do a quick presentation on Gordon Allport. He is the psychologist I chose for my final presentation. His life was basically dedicated completely to psychology, personality psychology specifically. Up until his death in 1967, he was working at Harvard and contributing to the field of psychology. So let's get started. His early life was pretty normal for somebody at the time. His parents were religious. They wanted him to go into a religion basically as his career, especially from his mother. She wanted him and his brothers to be missionaries and travel around and spreading religion, which never ended up happening. Him and all of his brothers ended up doing other things. And what's more fascinating is that during high school, he actually got away from religion some. He talked about how he didn't understand why God would let things happen or why religion was important in the first place. However, in his college days, in his philosophy classes specifically, he thought about how there's certain things in the world that to him could only be explained by God, and he kind of reacquired his religious ideas. We'll get into that more later. In high school, he was very reserved, quiet. He liked to read. It gave him a lot of time to study and think about things. He talked about how he didn't really fit in, that sort of thing. However, his grades were great in high school, and it allowed him to get a scholarship to Harvard, which is actually where his brother was working on his PhD beforehand, so he had a little familiarity there. At Harvard, he acquired his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in a fairly short amount of time. He also contributed a lot to social work and contributed to different social programs, and that's where he really started getting the idea of personality psychology or what makes a person them. So this is where it gets a little complicated. When he was in Harvard and after he left Harvard, he traveled around a bunch. He went to many different places. So he finished his bachelor's degree at Harvard in 1919. Easy enough. And then he finished his master's and PhD from 1920 to 1922. However, there's a lot of things that happened in that time. In 1919, he moved to Istanbul and taught at Robert College for a year. And he actually taught what he had just gotten a degree in, which was philosophy and economics. Doesn't really have anything to do with psychology at this point. So after he got done teaching at Istanbul, he moved back to Harvard to finish his master's and PhD. He then got a fellowship from Harvard to travel to Germany and the UK, where he studied in Berlin and Hamburg and Cambridge University. He also met his wife, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Ada Lufkin Gold, in Germany, and after that, things started to settle down a little bit for him. So after he got back from his fellowship, he started working at Harvard. He taught there for 2 years and then became an assistant professor at Dartmouth College for 4 years, I believe. And then from 1930 to 1967, he totally settled down and decided it was time to stick to one place. And he had many different jobs. He was an associate professor, a whole bunch of different things. And he just stayed working there, studying, teaching, a whole bunch of things there. So in that time, some of his major works and publications came out, obviously. His most famous one is probably Personality, a Psychological Interpretation, which he wrote in 1937. This surrounded trait theory and his cardinal, central, and secondary traits. So what those are different, essentially, levels of what a personality is. You have your first one, which is cardinal. This is the broadest type of trait. Not everybody has one. It's something like what you consider Abraham Lincoln, like Honest Abe. Something that when somebody says their name, it's the first thing you think of. So another example might simply be a clown. You think their cardinal trait would be funny. It's a little bit more simple, but not everyone has one. That's the important thing. It's something that is overwhelming to their personality. A central trait is what you would call defines a person as themselves. So like funny, caring, smart, things like that. That you see them and you think after you get to know them, oh, this person's this or they're so and so. Secondary traits are traits that only come out in certain instances. So an example would be like how a person responds to stress. It could be they just shut down. They go quiet. They don't want to do anything. Another person response to stress could be yelling or screaming, getting mad. Those would be secondary traits. They're not essential to a personality. They just come out in certain instances. Or if you're in a group of friends and you start making a lot of jokes, that could be that as well. His next work, The Nature of Prejudice, which came out in 1954, was important to kind of explain how prejudice works and what people do or what you can do to combat it. And this was actually looked at later on, which we'll get to in a little bit. So the scale of prejudice and discrimination is one of the main points of that book. It has 5 different levels, which are anti-locution, avoidance, discrimination, physical attack, and extermination. Each one is more extreme than the next. So anti-locution is discussing your prejudicial values or ideas with other people that are of the same mind. So you talk about what you don't like to another person with the same idea. You're not directly affecting the person that you're talking about. And then the next level is avoidance. This would be actively avoiding them. Say you see somebody that you're prejudicial against at the supermarket. You would intentionally avoid them. The next one is discrimination. You purposely keep them out. You're not allowing them in your store, things like that. Physical attack, self-explanatory. You try to attack them, hurt them, physically harm them. And extermination would be genocide, essentially. You can think about the Holocaust would be a big one. So that kind of laid the groundwork of ideas of how you can combat it and ways that psychologists can look at discrimination and come up with ideas to treat it. Maybe not treat it, but acknowledge it and find ways to fix it. And then some of his other lesser known works, he has a ton of them. One of them is The Individual and His Religion. This one I find interesting because it talks about his journey with religion, which I mentioned earlier, and what made him start religious, lose his religion, and then come back to it. And then The Person in Psychology, this is just a collection of essays that came out, I think, a year after his death. So it's just, a lot of his other works are just a combination of different essays and papers and not necessarily actual books. So some of his lasting impacts, this is just a very brief rundown. He is the founder of personality psychology, and which allowed a lot of psychologists to follow in his footsteps, expand on his ideas, contribute more. A lot of it has to do with the patient, or in a clinical sense, the patient is the expert on themselves. So for therapy, the patient knows best about them, is the idea of personality psychology or humanistic therapy, which is kind of a branch of it. What I talked about, strategies to combat discrimination, one of the biggest ones is contact theory, which essentially is the more time you spend with them, the less discriminatory you're going to be or less prejudicial you'll be. There's studies on this that show it's effective, and it's kind of like exposure and response therapy, where the more you do it, the less you realize it's harmful or bad or whatever, however you want to describe it. And then there's one thing called the MBTI. This is more of a pseudoscience area, which kind of stemmed from this. It doesn't mean much, but people like to think it does. It's where there's like a 4-letter type of person that somebody is. I think when I took it, I'm a INFJ. I don't remember what that means, but that's what I am. It's just a way to put yourself into a certain category, and people like to do that. It's just kind of for fun, but it shouldn't be taken seriously. So that is a little rundown of Gordon Allport and his works and his life. Thank you for watching.